And we're live. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, hobbits, extraterrestrials, hobbits, and cryptids, to another episode of Scuttlebutt with the Phill. Tonight we will be discussing Lord of the Rings as part of our fantasy month here on the channel. With me for the second time is my friend Benjamin Franson. And in case you are not familiar with him, we'll reintroduce him in a second, and dive into a little bit about Lord of the Rings as we explore quite the dense lore. I mean, we won't get to everything, of course. We're only going to have maybe 45 to an hour to discuss everything, and we probably won't cover everything. But without further ado, I'll introduce my friend, Benjamin Franson.
Hello there. I am a lit nerd and was delighted at the prospect of leaping into Tolkien land.
Yep.
Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah. Well, we did at least I did my best to kind of figure out what I've been seeing in a lot of these MFA programs, where oftentimes we're seeing a lot of, at least what I've seen in the lower undergraduate era, these people who are often trying to do their own version of Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or Harry Potter, and so not always successfully, but I guess I could give them credit for just wanting to do something so dense while not exactly having all the tools or even the skills to do so. I mean, there's an audacity there that I think is kind of laudable, so I won't take that from them necessarily, but I feel like you need to be a certain type of writer. I mean, even Tolkien himself was, if I remember correctly, a medievalist, so he was somebody who, he was steeped in a lot of this dense Old English style things, and if I remember correctly, he was a man who typically liked, or generally wanted to, basically create these languages and then just build the stories around the languages. And that kind of idea is fascinating. I can't even think about constructing a language, let alone, I mean, doing my own world building stuff in my own fiction is its own little thing, but having to develop entire lexicons, entire, communicative skills for that is kind of insane, especially not even that the language itself. I mean, you're talking the written language and the spoken language. This is all Tolkien's, imagination doing that, and that's fascinating to me. But yep. How was your introduction to Tolkien?
Well, I picked a book up and got so locked into The Hobbit that I read it over the course of an afternoon and an evening. Obviously, that's a bit shorter than the others, but I was hooked, particularly because of the riddles. And nothing sticks in your head like having a problem that you can't quite solve. And so starting to think in terms of riddles and poetry, and the riddles and some of the foreshadowings and the prophecies are all in poetry. Me being a poet, I was hooked pretty early on.
So when did you first discover Tolkien's writings? Was it?
I read the series in, I think it was fourth grade. The first time.
Okay. Would that be around? I don't know if you had seen the animated films that they produced back in the 70s, but that was kind of my introduction to the whole thing. And I guess my grandmother had the VHS copies of those, and so that's why I would watch those before I even got the Peter Jackson created ones. And so I still haven't seen his version of The Hobbit, which I think is like 3 or 4 movies now, which I think is quite baffling considering the fact that the book, I believe, is shorter than the main trilogy.
Right.
So I don't know how that happened, but I'm sure that there's theories about why and how that happened, but that seems kind of baffling to me. But yeah, was your anybody else in your family sort of, readers of the Tolkien works?
They all read them. My dad is a huge C.S. Lewis fan, and he started reading Tolkien because he was reading all C.S. Lewis's stuff, and then he found out that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were best buddies at Oxford and reading each other's drafts of things, and even very likely influencing each other's drafts of things. And when you read some of, especially like the last battle, that section compared with Return of the King, and I can see a lot of corollaries between those two and them being writing contemporaries. In fact, I even mentioned to you in class, it would be interesting if later on, after we've all published way too many books, that people can say, hey, those guys were all in the same MFA program at San Diego State.
Yeah.
They used to sit around and drink overpriced coffee together in the lobby right over there.
Yeah. I mean, that would be obviously very lovely. And I am obviously hoping for everybody in the cohort to definitely get out there and publish as much as they can so that, we can have that kind of a conversation later. The thing I do appreciate about the program is that we have such a diverse, even beyond just, race and, sort of orientation background. We just have such a diversity of different stories that people are telling. It's not the same thing over and over. We're not getting you can probably tell I'm traumatized by my undergrad work where it was like 50 or 60% Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings knockoff work, and it wasn't like quality work. So it was kind of like having to help them out. I had to bring up things that I am familiar with that I thought would help them out. And so I would refer to them to the works of Stephen King's own writing or J. Michael Straczynski's Being a Writer, Staying a Writer, and then hoping that would be enough information imparted to them so that it would work out. But we're going to find out exactly how all that works out. But beyond that, I guess we can get into some of the nitty-grittiness of the whole thing. Now, you'd mentioned earlier that the Silmarillion is the only thing that you haven't checked out.
I did try reading parts of it, but I think I was a little traumatized myself because I was trying to read it the first time I read the series, and I was in 4th grade. And it is still complicated, and I say that someone who recently got a bachelor's in English from UCLA. That's Silmarillion is still very complicated, and it has a lot more of the lingual cues and the historical. I almost want to call it apocrypha or something. There's so many things in there that do relate to other sections, but it's almost more like reading the nerd notes from Comic-Con where people are telling you things, but I bet you didn't know that the original version of that was written totally differently.
Yeah.
And it felt parallel maybe, but it didn't really feel like part of the canon to me. I realize it is, but it just didn't feel like it to me.
Yeah, I know I bought it and I still haven't read it. I have been reading Wikipedia, sort of the breakdown of it and whatever I see on TV tropes. But yeah, it's not that I find it daunting or anything. It's just more like, from what I have been told, is that that's more of a sort of gives you more of like a background within the lore. And I think a little bit later on, I'm hoping we can do something called the Lore of the Rings, not just the Lord of the Rings.
Cool.
So we can dive a little bit more into that in a few, hopefully. But yeah, I think for me, the way I found out about it, I think it was around the time, a little bit before that, like the late 90s, like 1999. My grandma had bought, I think in the 70s, her own, I think it was because they were watching, my dad and everybody were watching the animated stuff, and they got so deep into it that they bought these really, really classy looking Lord of the Rings books. And I'm like, man, I want to have these. I even told my grandma that I would like to have these if, something happened to her. And she was more than willing to part with it. But for whatever reason, we were only able to, I think, recover her copy of The Hobbit when she passed on. And so I don't know who got a hold of the Lord of the Rings box set that she had. But yeah, they lucked out. Yeah. That's probably the only thing I would steal. I mean, I don't try to endorse too many crimes, but that I would do. Then again,
steal this book.
Yeah. So I mean, there's worse things to steal. I suppose definitely that is the truth. But yeah, I think for me, it's a little bit special to me in the sense that maybe more than that, because my sister and I and my little brother, we would sit down some nights and we would read from this big old tome, all 3 books, squashed together, and still want to know where those books went, because that's it was like this, like a big door stopper with all 3 books in them.
Who are your favorite characters?
It's always gone back and forth with me. I mean, in the live action stuff, I think I'm a fan of Legolas, but in the books themselves, I think I'm a fan of Aragorn, just because of the idea of some kind of a guy like that would be, I would imagine, upstanding.
Strider.
Yeah. So, do you have do you delineate who was your favorite from different mediums?
I think Treebeard Fangorn was my favorite,
Mhm.
and I really liked the cinema representation for him was great too.
Hmm.
Ents take a long time to say everything because Ents never say anything that isn't worth taking a long time to say.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great.
Very zen, right?
That is.
Cool contrast of them being paired with the two most immature, impatient hobbits in the story.
Yeah, pretty much. And then, that's the whole. I know that there was a kind of a joke said, I think in the mid 2000s, thanks to a little movie called Clerks 2, where they were trying to make fun of the Lord of the Rings movies as like the movies are just nothing but people walking. And then like in what was it, the Two Towers, he's like they kind of like they're walking, but they take a trip, or they trip over something, and then by part 3 they just throw the ring into the volcanic soup, and then they joke that even the trees walked in those movies. Everybody walked. And I'm like, well, that's why there's always a joke that why didn't they, they could have saved all kinds of time if they would have just, enlisted the Eagles to come in and save them at the end. But I even think Tolkien, reached out about that and was like, but then you wouldn't have this whole story. And I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, sometimes you have to make these narrative choices that some may find suspect, but then again, sometimes it works.
Yeah, the first time I saw Mystery Science Theater 3000, they were trying to analyze this plot of some horrible movie they were watching. And it was prehistoric. So they were talking about like, oh, God, prehistoric caves are scary. I can't believe I'm in here. And the other one says, yes, but luckily there's a handrail. And you realize in the movie they actually filmed part of a handrail inside of this prehistoric cave. And then one of them says, is that him again? And the other one says, isn't he dead? Like, and then he gets so frustrated, he throws his popcorn in the air and says, Tolkien couldn't follow this plot.
Yeah. That's great.
Because Tolkien is a master of intricate A story, B story, C story up through like G or H,
Yeah. No, I mean, really. But yeah, I think we could even dive into, because I mean, generally speaking, I think the outline of the entire Lord of the Rings is essentially The Hobbit, and then Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and then you have Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, and then Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, and then you have sort of a coda to all that, which is the Silmarillion, at least in terms of what I'm going to refer to just here as the scope of Lord of the Rings. But I think generally speaking, I'm a little bit, I'm aware that there's a lot more than just that, but we'll get to some of the other things as we go. But I want to address a tiny little comment somebody made. Thank you, DJ Play Nice, for saying hi and trying to bump up the algorithm. We do need it. He's one of these commenters that I have who's viewing me, and a friend of mine, Jill Calderon. We do right now we're doing a For All Mankind review, so it's a TV show on Apple TV Plus. It's about a world where the Russians beat us to the moon back in the 60s, and so obviously up my alley, but
and to space.
Yeah. So we've been having a lot of fun doing that. But yeah, back to Tolkien. We have more than just those stories, because I've been walking through Barnes and Nobles periodically, and I'm like seeing like more books that are associated with the Tolkien Middle Earth scope. And from what I'm hearing, there's a like anime film coming out this December that I just saw the trailer for, and I'm kind of fascinated by it. But I'm told it's like a prequel, but it's set even further before The Hobbit. So now I'm kind of curious what that would even be. I don't know if you've even heard of this, but from what I am aware of, I know there's a big movement to kind of expand the franchise and sort of make it as large, even though conceptually and lore wise it is pretty dense. But right now they have an Amazon television show called the Rings of Power,
I've seen it.
and I have not seen. What do you think?
Everybody dies in the end.
Well,
Just kidding. They don't really.
yeah,
I always say that. I like pretending to spoil things.
yeah,
I was a fan. I liked some of the characters are really solid. One of the most believable, uncontrived, strong female characters I've seen in a long time. So that was good.
I remember hearing a lot of stuff on Twitter, which when you hear things on Twitter these days, it's kind of like basically just disregarded anyway. But there was a lot of discussion because I guess there was kind of controversy about reframing a certain character as like a heroine, or kind of reframing like racial things within certain stories. And so then people were starting to argue about wokeism and like you're trying to do whatever it is with those characters. And I've always kind of disagreed with what even this notion of wokeness even is. And so I've been kind of
Well, if you don't
fascinated.
know what it is, then obviously you're just not woke to it yet. So you
Yeah.
can't know.
I mean, it's kind of fascinating because people are saying, oh, something is too woke. But like if I remember correctly, the opposite of being awoke should be asleep, if I'm not mistaken. So is it really that much better to admit that somebody is anti-woke, being they're still asleep? I don't know if that really works for their metaphor, but nevertheless, that is the
Well, I also wonder, woke by whom? Did I wake on my own? Like if I'm woke, did I become woke because I heard a bunch of things and they enlightened me and I saw things through a different lens? Or does it mean that simply that I ascribe to beliefs 14 through 16? I don't know. I have a little hard time with it. I don't like things that play with words in that way. I'm actually have zero problem with gender inclusion in all of its various forms. I just in particular don't like the word they, not because I disagree with the concept or its attempt at polite distancing but I just don't like that it's vague. It's less specific now. So if you make a new word that makes language harder to communicate and this catches on, we're going to be pretty soon in 1984 land, or do you want to, or Brave New World with double plus I'm good, do we want to have words like that? Because if you say they, am I talking to an individual? Am I talking to 26 people? I don't know now. And before I did. So we added a word and took away some meaning.
I mean, there's kind of that, I'm obviously not a big scholar in gender studies as much as I guess some would want me to be. But I mean, generally speaking, I mean, they does kind of seem a little bit sort of distancing and kind of removing the humanity from someone. And I don't know how that would be something anybody would want to be called. I mean, I understand that people do. I mean, that works for you. That's perfectly fine. I'm not going to judge you for doing so, but I just feel like that would be sort of emblematic of, kind of depersonalization or defamiliarization with what a person is. And in that way, that aspect of it's kind of fascinating to me. But even beyond that, the charges against the Rings of Power for being quote unquote woke because there was, female lady is a hero. And it's like, is that what the standard is now, that you can't have females, being heroes because it kind of violates somebody's misconceived notions of what a man and, that person's, or a male figure being the hero of a story? I don't know. It's bizarre.
I kind of felt like there were other female heroes. And I mean, on some level, you kind of have to count Galadriel as maybe not a stereotypical hero, but I mean, a person of incredible strength. I mean, it wasn't as if this was some weak damsel needing to be rescued by others. She was the one saving people, and much of it,
Yeah. I mean, that's
and complicating Aragorn's brain.
Yeah. So I mean, that's sort of where I'm at, where it's like it works and functions perfectly fine within the context of the story. She's not doing it because, like, I'm a woman. I need, I demand respect. I demand all this. It's like, no, she's just doing these things because, she has to represent her people and obviously defend them. And so there's nothing wrong with that. But it's kind of bizarre. But even beyond that, kind of getting back to this anime movie that's coming out, because again, I haven't seen the Rings of Power. It's kind of been weirdly split, because I have some people who tell me that, oh my God, it's so bad. And I'm like, these are the same people who do complain about wokeness all the time, so I can't really trust what they're saying. And then you have the ones who are kind of apolitical, don't really care about that, but they're just watching whatever it is they're saying. So their reaction is a lot more even killed. And then those people are saying something that says, yeah, you should watch it, make up your own mind. And that, I think, is always the best position to find yourself in. Don't let the media or anybody try to tell you what something is. You should always, go out there and find out for yourself instead of having someone else tell you what it is. But not to be on a soapbox about that too much, but even beyond that, they have this animated movie coming out. I'm kind of curious what it's even going to be, because I remember they said it was going to be a prequel. That's all I know, and that's kind of fascinating. But for whatever reason, I want to look it up, and we can't find it because there's no internet right where I am on my phone.
What?
So
how are you supposed to think without the internet? It doesn't make
exactly.
any sense. Well, so in the interim period, though, Smeagol is one of my favorite characters.
Interesting. Why is that?
Because he's so resilient.
So you admire his resiliency.
Yeah, I mean, considering he manages to exhibit this tenderness sometimes, and then he's got his other Jekyll,
Right.
He's got his other Mr. Hyde thing going on to his Jekyll, but he travels like all the way across Middle Earth just with this determination. And even though the determination is largely about him trying to get the ring back, it wasn't his fault. I mean, he was addicted,
Mm-hmm.
He got that stuff in him and
Mm-hmm.
like any addict. And I think that it's interesting when it gets way into that he used to be something like a hobbit 500 years earlier, whatever it was.
Yeah. That's kind of the fascinating thing about, the lore of the Rings, which we'll get to in a minute, which is, the characters can be sometimes thousands if they're like elves, or even, hundreds of years old, like some of the hobbits even. And I think we'll get into a discussion of locations in a bit. But I think for me, it's like when you're kind of exploring a world like this, and you have these like really heavy themes, because you kind of touched on this idea of addiction, which I don't think at the time was really explored that often within the scope of fantasy. And I guess that's like I don't want to speak too soon for that, but I kind of feel like that was like the first instance of something like that in the fantasy realm. Although I could be wrong. Somebody quote me on that and fight me on it.
Ta-da.
But I mean, there's a larger element of Lord of the Rings that I think has always been fascinating, which is literally touching on this idea of authoritarianism. Because you have Sauron, who's like basically trying to take control over everything, and he's become sort of the archetypal, villain of everything. And that kind of element is kind of explored in a lot of fantasy stories, a lot of like fantasy knockoff stories, even try to do the same kind of, tract. And I don't know if it's always successful, but
should do some quizzes.
Yeah.
How many people? We should see if anybody responds before the end of the.
Yeah.
What riddle starts off? What riddle starts off in this way, and what is the answer?
Yeah.
This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone know? Let's see if they respond.
Yeah. Well, I think if you guys have something on that one, that riddle, you definitely need to reach out. I'm thinking about one day once we get a option to have what's the YouTube term for it is memberships or subscriptions that go beyond just your average. I subscribe to you, so you're now a member of the channel, and we can do membership streams where we can kind of hold polls and kind of discuss things of that nature. And I think that would be a great idea, and I think we should explore it very, very soon. But again, if you guys have a reference to that, definitely make it known. But yeah, beyond that, even what do you think is one of the biggest themes that you take away from the Lord of the Rings as a whole?
Second chances.
Hmm.
I mean, the sword that was broken becoming one again.
Hmm.
The king dethroned and becoming an unknown ranger. Even Smeagol,
Hmm.
who has the ring stolen, he has an option to become something different. He has a second chance, as its poison is drawing away from him, but he can't help himself. But each of these people, there are quite a lot of people who get a second chance to be themselves.
Hmm.
Or the King of Rohan, who had Wormtongue talking into him and weakening his strength and his fortitude. Even he, right towards the end, when he becomes somewhat of his formal self, has a little for some last hurrah to earn a little bit of his lost honor back. And
Hmm.
I don't know, second chances are a really powerful theme.
Yeah, I can see that. I think it's without question. But even beyond that, for me, I think even beyond the theme of authoritarianism, I think the one thing I do take away from Lord of the Rings that might be a little more broad, I guess, is this idea that when you're backed into a corner, you can get a bunch of people who don't agree or generally wouldn't be associated or generally agree with each other to unite behind a cause that is sort of noble and worthy. And in my view, I think that's a very powerful thing to take away from. I think that is the main thing to take away from it. But generally speaking, I would like to see more of that in fiction these days because I feel like there's a lot of discussion of division and how that affects us in today's society, and I think that's very important. But I feel like if we don't see the other side of that, then we won't ever really be able to manifest that in the real world. And so I feel like if we don't ever manifest that in some way, things will get really, really interesting, especially since we're now just a few days away from a presidential election here in the United States. And I always say, I don't care who you vote for, as long as you do, you should exercise your rights because some people don't have that uh, outside of the United States and some even in the United States. But it's always good to definitely exercise your rights because they can be taken away very easily. And you kind of see a little bit of that in Lord of the Rings to an extent, especially once Sauron starts starting to suck up everything else in his areas. But we're going to take a couple of seconds to thank our main sponsor, the main company that so far keeps me going, which is my company, Vega Aerospace Entertainment Division. So Vega Aerospace, in space, no one can hear you. Okay, so we are now at the 30-minute mark. I'm surprised. So I think that's where we get into something a little more deeper. We'll call this round
I believe it's more deeperest.
Deeperest. We'll go with that. We'll get to the lore of the rings. Lord of the Rings.
Dun, dun.
So, what do you think is Tolkien's most powerful lore element?
The geography and the genealogy,
Hmm.
which are very closely tied to each other.
Hmm.
Because it reminds me of reading the old Bibles that have the maps of Syria and the Mesopotamia and getting to see where Paul's missionary journeys went or those kinds of things.
Hmm.
It brings it to life to see the maps of the time and where the borders are at the time.
Hmm.
So since he has a lot of those pencil drawing maps inside, I found myself frequently flipping back to see the maps as I was walking through. Like when they got to the part about the birds, I'm like, wait, where are they?
Yeah.
So then I go back in. And also what I think is fun is I hear voices, and I think they're coming to take me away right now because that sounds not so great out of context. But I hear voices in my head as I read things. So oftentimes I insert my own accents or guttural voices or tunes even. So when I remember the books, I remember the tune I heard, and I have no idea where the tune came from, or if I made it up, but like when they're trapped up in the trees, they're stuck up there I think they were hiding from trolls or something. But I remember the song, and I can hear the tune of 15 birds in 5 bird trees. Oh, what shall we do with the funny little things? And later on, I thought, I wasn't watching the movies. I was reading it, so I think I made the tune up. I don't know. But I remembered a lot of, I especially liked something deep about the kind of poetry it was. It's not easy to write good rhyming poetry. It's quite difficult.
Yeah.
It lends itself so well to cheesiness if you don't make it good. And so the things in that story, the rhymes that Tolkien wrote, those prophecies and everything, like when he talked about, not all those who wander are lost.
Yeah.
I love that one.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to probably put that in my my next week's class session for the students I have.
From the ashes a fire shall be woken, a light from the shadows shall spring, renewed shall be blade that was broken, and crownless again shall be king. Sounds like a psalm or something, I mean,
almost, yeah. I mean, it's definitely, we can definitely get into the, Christian theology element, because I mean, Tolkien is, unabashedly sort of a,
Sure, but he was still a lot more subtle than C.S. Lewis was.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
C.S. Lewis had a stone table that cracked in half when Aslan gave his life for the sinner.
Yeah,
Edmund. I mean,
I mean that's the thing. I mean, not to shit on C.S. Lewis too much, or the Chronicles of Narnia, which I like. I like both. They're both, they operate on different wavelengths. But definitely the Christian narrative. I mean, you have Aslan, and you have this connection with, Jesus Christ, and so you have, a lot more. I wouldn't say complicated, but it's less complicated in the Narnia books, whereas in Lord of the Rings, there's a lot more subtlety. It's not as out in your face. So I do agree with that point. But I mean, what would you say would be the starkest Christian element that you think appears in the Lord of the Rings?
Return of the King. I mean, it's pretty difficult to implicate something like the Second Coming any more on the nose than titling one of the books Return of the King.
Yeah.
Not that it was painting Aragorn as Jesus or anything, but I mean, in terms of the elements of people waiting and losing faith and forgetting that they had a king and that he was one of them, and where is he? And people have been saying the king will return someday, but not in my lifetime. I don't know. Just the whole waiting for God to do what he said he was going to do kind of thing.
Yeah. I think it's kind of interesting to me in the sense that, because in a couple of weeks we're going to cover Arthurian legends, and a lot of King Arthur stories are essentially reformatted Christ tales, because you do have this element. King Arthur is going to be the once was king, he'll be king again, and so it's sort of the parable of the thing we're supposed to learn about the second coming and Easter and his resurrection. And so it's not that it's subtle or anything. It's just that's why I've always kind of contended that it's important to read the Bible as part of part of a literature course. Whereas, there's so many literary allusions pretty much everywhere in English literature. And if you don't learn those like primer elements that are throughout, the Old Testament and the New Testament, you're not going to actually know what the literary allusions are.
Some of our most common literary phrases are directly out of the Bible that people wouldn't know otherwise.
Yeah.
Like the writing on the wall from Daniel.
Yeah.
And so many things turning back and looking back and being turned to a pillar of salt. And so many of these old stories exist.
Yeah.
Even the word lot from parking lot. A lot of these things are direct allusions. I think too that for that same reason, though, it's important to read other pieces. Like there's a section in the poem piece I'm doing this weekend for the TEDx thing that says, "We are the children of Tune In Next Week, the offspring of the Bod and the Veda." And of course, if you're looking at the Vedas, I mean, if you were cookie cutter Christian and not willing to read any other text, you wouldn't even catch the line. You wouldn't know what it meant, and you might miss the whole point.
Yeah.
So it's important to read all those things for those reasons too.
Yeah. I mean, as somebody who's a dastardly unbeliever, even I can't question the influence that the Bible, at least in my interpretation, the one that I feel, because I mean, there's different versions of the Christian Bible.
Even just the historicity of it, though, there are things where people are using what's in the Bible, a la Raiders of the Lost Ark, to try to find something like the Pool of Siloam, for example. And when they get enough other clues from taking where something is mentioned in the Bible, they find that archaeological thing. It happens quite often. And so that's interesting because it doesn't necessarily change how it should or does affect your faith, if you want to call it faith, if you're atheist or agnostic. But it does at least show that there's a lot of genuine history in the book because people are finding genuine historical artifacts by following the clues in the book. So it kind of makes the rest of it come alive to me, knowing that they'll talk about where something is and you can find it. You really might find the Shroud of Turin or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, no, I don't discount that, there's a historicity element to Christianity. I think that's pretty much, without question. But I guess for me, I've always approached, any discussion of the Bible as, I know there's different versions of it. And as far as I'm aware, I've always gone to the King James version of the Bible as kind of like not the default, but sort of the one that I feel is referenced more frequently than not throughout English literature. And so if I were to teach a literature course, it would probably come from that specific version of it. But
my dad no longer reads any of the other versions, kind of for the same reason. And he reads every day. So, I mean, it is much different though. Sometimes you start reading about whither thou goest, and if you're not in the mood to catch the references, you might be thinking, wait, what?
Yeah.
What did they just say? That if thou shalt confess with thy mouth, If you've been kind of studying Shakespeare or other Old English more recently, then it's less of a leap.
Yeah.
But a lot of the phrasing in Tolkien's work sounds like the King James, especially the older italicized allusions to some prophecy or some poem or spells that they have.
Yeah. I've actually always wanted to, if I was ever going to do a Lord of the Rings fan fiction thing or whatever, or if they came up to me and said, "Hey, do you want to contribute something to the Lord of the Rings franchise or, body of work?" I think I would want to make something that's set like maybe 500 or 1,000 years later. And then we see all of the events from the Lord of the Rings basically be sort of the Bible for the world that happens afterwards.
Right.
And so I would be curious to see how a world like that would manifest. It would be like everything we see in the Lord of the Rings essentially becomes the foundation of a global religion in the future. And I think that would be sort of fascinating to dive into.
For sure.
But they do, this kind of segueing into a larger portion, also related to the Lord of the Rings. They have a tabletop RPG, sort of like a Dungeons and Dragons version of Lord of the Rings that's coming out. It's called The One Ring. Yeah, at some point I'll have to get a hold of it, but at the moment I'm currently on a book purchasing
Oh,
moratorium. So
your lady grounded you, right?
yeah, so I guess I was getting too crazy, but maybe she has a point. But
Just because someone's right doesn't mean you have to let them win.
I mean, you're correct, but still, it's kind of strange that I can have a little bit of control, but not all the control. But
I mean, you in a relationship with a woman, and you think you have a semblance of control.
Yeah.
They're so cute when they're little.
Well, Ben is speaking from myself 20 years from now, possibly. But even beyond that,
how was the Jim Carrey quote?
Hmm.
Behind every great man, there is a woman rolling her eyes.
Yeah, I mean that's the best quote. Well, we do have because we brought up Mr. C.S. Lewis and his work on Narnia. Did you ever check out too much of his work?
Oh yeah, I read them all.
Okay.
Probably 3 times. I liked the 7 books. I love that the 7th book is actually the first book. And
yeah, now the order is quite remarkable.
I just think there's some beautiful descriptions in there. Like, I think if I were going to try to explain to an atheist or an agnostic person a little bit about the character of God, it would be much easier to do it by having them read that series of Aslan than it would be to just try to explain it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's God, so he's big and old and strong. Like, none of those things come anywhere near close to really explaining anything,
Yeah.
But when Aslan is resurrected and the stone table is cracked in half because of the old magic, which I love, the whole old magic thing, he is where Susan and Lucy are, and they think he's gone, and they came to get his body actually, and it was gone, which is another obvious parallel. And so he comes around, and they said he looked bigger and stronger, and they started playing with him, and he would jump up and bat him around with a big giant velvet paw, and he was being careful, but he was still awe-inspiring, and they were squealing with delight when he would kind of bat them around and jump on them and pounce and everything. And it said, for they knew that he loved them and would never do anything to hurt them, but they never ever forgot that he was a lion. And I thought, that is a really good description of what I consider to be the appropriate way to look at God. It's like, this is a being that loves you, but it's also a being of immense power. And I thought it was a really cool mix to explain, yes, but it's a lion.
Yeah.
All of that, but it's still a lion. You don't get to order it around and tell it what to do and put it in a little box in your apartment and tend to your other pets first and then go deal with the lion. The lion is going to take the lion's share of everything you're doing.
Yeah, I think there's a slightly crass reference in a movie called Grandma's Boy. It came out like almost 20 years ago, where this friend of this programmer character, he's like the main character, he was saying that because for some reason this guy's friend bought a lion, and he said that buying the lion had more value than buying a dog, because in his logic, buying a dog, you can get past a dog, but nobody fucks with a lion.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think that's a pretty good description of that. And maybe we can connect it back to Narnia and Tolkien. So even if we're being a bit crass, which would probably be uncouth to both Mr. Tolkien and Mr. Lewis, but I think it may even reinforce that point actually. But yeah, beyond that,
I just made an invitation to our classmate Emma.
Yeah.
editor extraordinaire as well.
Mhm.
She just said, "Oh, are you and Phill podcasting right now?"
Yeah.
I said, "Make a Tolkien comment. We'll include it right now. But hurry, they're running out of time."
Yeah.
So my other favorite characters.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things was the dynamic between dwarf and elf,
Mhm.
battle buddies.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
That was done in the movie really well too.
Yeah.
Legolas leaps up onto the back of the elephant. He's slicing people left and right, and finally grabs it up while it's running. Does like a flip and a somersault and slides down its, kills it and slides down its trunk like he's the Silver Surfer and ends up in the bottom.
Yeah.
And what does the dwarf say?
Mhm.
What still only counts as one.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great stuff. But yeah, I guess in terms of, I mean, I don't know if that'd be a third rail to talk about, but I'd say, what's your favorite race in the franchise? What would you want to be? I think is a better question. If you had a choice, if you could be catapulted into the world of Lord of the Rings, what would you want to be catapulted into? Would you want to be a hobbit? Would you want to be an elf? Would you want to be an orc?
Ooh,
So
I would not want to be an orc.
yeah,
I mean, I'm not beautiful now, but I have just a shred of vanity that would prevent me from wanting to be an orc.
okay,
It would probably make me a little bit less likely for any new media interviews coming out.
well, I mean, you could just still try, I suppose.
Yes, I think. Oh, and you know who Spencer Wilding is?
Name sounds familiar.
He is a creature actor.
Mhm.
So he played the Lord of the Uruk-hai in the movie.
Okay,
He's like 6'5" or 6'6" or something, and he's a kickboxing champion. So he's. Oh, and he also played the werewolf in The Prisoner of Azkaban.
Mhm.
So he's always playing those kinds of creature characters like that. So that's another little funny tidbit. So we did one of the booths with him when we were at Comic-Con.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was fighting. In fact, Elisa she came up to him like she was going to fight him.
Yeah.
Fists up and everything.
Oh, wow.
And instead of being offended or even joking, he was like, "Okay, so move this fist, move." So he stopped, went behind her, kicked her feet out a little bit, started playing with the stance. So I have a video of him correcting her fighting stance while she stays there and tries to look tough.
That's amazing.
Unbend your wrist a little bit,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so I guess if I had to come back, I would probably want to be. The elves seem so distant and whatnot.
Yeah.
But I think I would say a hobbit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would. I most fell in love with the hobbits.
Okay.
And they were kind of a ridiculous people. But for the most part, they were very quirky and weird and like narrow-minded and everything. I don't know. But at the same time, the hobbits, just by showing their own impatience and having no edifice about anything they were doing, like no artificiality in them, were able to convince the tree people, the Ents, to go to war when they had been so scared of doing it for eons. But they were able to do that one thing.
Yeah.
So when you look at who did what, I mean, the hobbits were tasked with bringing the ring to the ends of the earth to drop it in the lava pits.
Yeah.
And the hobbits were the ones who turned the tide of the war by including all of these Ents, these ancient creatures and everything. Like those little people, I mean, really, you could almost look at Pip as the first influencer.
I mean, I think we could. That's one way to put it. Yeah, I mean, if I had to be thrown into the world of Lord of the Rings, I mean, I like the idea of becoming an elf, but I wouldn't want to do elf shit. So I would be reticent to do that.
Elves even do that?
Yeah. I mean, depends, I suppose. But
is it golden?
Yeah, that's the really big question.
Yeah. And if it is, does it last forever?
Yeah. I wonder if it's kind of like gold in the world of Lord of the Rings.
Or does it come out with those little magic leaves that make things invisible? Also possible.
Yeah, honestly, I think that's worthy of an investigation. But yeah, we'll have to find out very soon. But I mean, I like the idea of becoming back as a hobbit, and doing all that, and even with the hairy feet, upper part of the feet. But yeah, I only know a handful of people. I think my dad told me that there was a guy he knew that actually had like some kind of, I don't know if it's like I would call it congenital defect or something, but it was definitely some kind of a some sort of a quirk in his genes that pretty much did the same thing, where he had hobbit feet, where he'd have like an entire layer of like hair just on the top of his feet. And I was like,
I know I had a roommate who did that too.
yeah,
I remember looking at his feet, and I didn't even say anything, and he goes, "I know they look like hobbit feet."
yeah,
Because they were really long, and I started laughing. I said, "Man, I would never have said that," but I mean,
yeah.
that's exactly what I was thinking. He goes, "I mean, how could you not? I mean, look at him."
I mean, yeah, that's the thing. But I mean, I don't want. I mean, I like the idea of entering the world of man and becoming like another human. But I feel like if you go into a fantasy world, you want to maybe pick some sort of a race within the scope of the world.
Yeah.
I know I wouldn't be an orc, not because I have anything against orcs necessarily, but or that I think I'm necessarily worthy of being, you know, not somebody who's less than ideally gifted in the appearance area. But I don't know.
So I have a question. You have been grounded from buying any more books, right?
Yeah.
What is the punishment for disobeying this new rule?
I don't think there is. I think it's just like a really bad look.
Really?
Yeah. And maybe
That's enough.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be enough.
I think that, and like, don't do it again, like pointing.
Not
But-
like sleeping on the couch or
I mean,
Phil special doghouse kind of thing with no
No.
books.
I mean, luckily she apparently likes the way she likes me being, sleeping beside her. So I don't know if that will ever be a punishment. She'll ever send me out, but so that part
Because
is
then
good.
she'd have to punish herself. I see.
Yeah. So
It makes sense.
ideally,
When is she going to be on the podcast? I got some questions for her.
Oh.
Now that I know you a bit, I want
You're gonna
to
be
see
like,
pictures.
why?
I want embarrassing stories, all of it.
Well, that will have to definitely be a podcast episode
Yeah.
because I have yet to do a video about myself. So a lot of these channels end up having videos about themselves, but I don't know. I like the idea of coming back as an ent. Just be a tree. Just chill all day and just be in nature. I think we'll go with that temporarily. And, you can fuck up all kinds of, villainy, scum and villainy out there in Middle Earth because you're a giant tree. They try to burn you down, but it won't always work. Not when you have hobbits that
Not
are
when
helping
you're
you
that
out.
big.
Hmm?
Not when you're that big, too.
No, definitely not. So,
They weren't really trees, right? They were like tree shepherds.
yeah, something like that.
They seemed to be trees, but they were much bigger.
Yeah, there's something more to them.
I wondered about that, though. My favorite place on earth is Sequoia, and it's because of ancient living things.
Mhm.
We don't have any other ancient living things, really.
Yeah.
We mentioned Christ before. Well, there's a tree there. There's a number of trees there that were 20, 30 feet tall. Christ was born, and they're still growing.
Mhm.
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
There's the average large, tall American pine tree can make up to 150, 200,000 matchsticks
Mhm.
if you cut it down.
Yeah.
That tree, the General Sherman in
Yeah.
Sequoia,
Mhm.
they figured out it would make 5 billion matchsticks compared to the 1 or 200,000 from a pine. That's just so much mass.
Yeah.
It's 38 feet around in one spot.
I still have yet to go to, any redwoods or even sequoias, even though I love the Sierras. That's kind of, fascinating to me that I haven't been to those two spots yet.
Yeah, we should try to figure out a way to do that this year.
Yeah. I mean, I've been, when I was seeing one of my exes, I was up in Northern California, and she lived in an area called Quincy. And that's kind of like 90 miles away from Chico, 90 miles away from Reno. So you're basically in the middle of nothing, the middle of the forest, Plumas National Forest. And so you're right in like the shadow of Lake Tahoe. And I recently, for the first time, been to Lake Tahoe last summer, and you're surrounded by just nothing but nature. And I guess that's why I would be leaning toward being, some type of tree or tree adjacent character, just because I can be enveloped in this thing and just chill with it forever. But I think the only downside to being something like that is that, if you're a writer and you love to write on, say, paper,
The opposable thumbs problem.
and that too, but not even that. It's that at what point does it become kind of like a weird sort of like cannibalistic attitude to like, you're writing on paper that was produced by, out of, other beings just like you. So I don't know. It seems it's like feeding chicken nuggets to, little chickens out here on a farm. It's like really bizarre sort of cannibalism. So yeah, that's something to consider. It's not like the biggest thing, but it's something to consider.
I kind of think that makes it cooler in a way.
Yeah.
Like, how much would a book be worth if we printed it on actual pressed out flat human skin?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's probably some people out there. I'm sure Ed Gein probably had a thought or two about that, but
puts the lotion into the basket.
Exactly. I know it was just Halloween, so we're kind of out of season for that. But again, this is the fantasy month, and fantasy is not without its own little delves into cosmic horror in its own. They used to have a video game of Lord of the Rings that was completely like removed from the Peter Jackson films and even elements that had come before it. So it was its own little thing, and there was like interesting elements of cosmic horror throughout, and that on its own should show everyone here at home that just because something is fantasy doesn't mean it can't be blended with something else. There's science fiction fantasy that's really big right now. I mean, you have Star Wars, you have Dune to an extent. I don't know if I'd necessarily call Dune complete fantasy, other than, say, for example, the sort of neo-feudalist element and some of the little discussions of the voice and things like that. Eventually, I'll do a Dune podcast episode, but we'll get to that probably next year.
Yes.
But without further ado, we're coming up on our first little hour, and I think that's pretty good.
So, I want to hear if anybody remembers which riddle that was.
Yeah.
This thing, all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers.
Yeah. I'm waiting on somebody.
Slays kings, ruins towns, and beats high mountain down.
Mm-hmm.
Comes first, follows after, ends life, kills laughter.
Yep.
Bunch more clues.
Yeah.
I don't know if the clue will help you with the answer, but it will give you a clue into the my endless capacity for useless information.
Wow.
Well, it was useless until you had this podcast, so thanks for that.
Well, that's why I was I was mentioning earlier that you never know when something will become useful. So
if even just for a party trick,
even that, I mean, anything, even if you're having just something for discussion or just a dialogue, any little bit, you never know when you might be able to pull it out, and all it does is serve to enrich the human experience and the human condition. But without that, I think we can close out. Next week, we'll be covering Harry Potter, and then the week after that, we'll be covering Arthurian legends. So we'll kind of cover the whole gamut and the hundreds of years of Arthurian stories that have come out since the very first stories of La Morte d'Arthur had come out. And the week after that, I'm flirting with the idea of posting a video about Dragon Riders of Pern. We'll see how we get to that one. That one will be
that's right.
recorded.
With the Lady Anne.
Yep. That will be, hopefully.
What was the protagonist? Manali?
Yeah.
Manali?
Yeah.
Yeah, she was cool.
Yeah.
I thought that was so neat. Just that whole idea of here's this warrior class can possibly be noble and honored enough to have a dragon. She's got like 7 of them.
Yeah. So for you folks at home, the Dragon Riders of Pern will be a video that will be pre-recorded and probably released over Thanksgiving for everyone who wants to kind of have a break from their families. So, I think we can shoot that pretty soon. But anyway, for the folks at home, if you're still tuning in, just want you guys to know that you guys are appreciated. I appreciate everything you guys do, no matter what. as always, my sign off is don't forget your towel, don't panic, and so long, and thanks for all the fish.